because we've been focused so much on race, I'm going to be joined by a journalist and an author. Her name is Tracie McMillan. She wrote a very interesting book that just came out about a month ago. And the book is called The White Bonus: 5 Families and the Cash Value of Racism in America. This book traces just how much of Tracie's family's modest wealth can be attributed to policies and practices that have systemically hurt Black families. So Tracie did this very thorough investigation. She did interviews. She collected data from family members, and she examined in this book how racism has shaped her life as well as the lives of 4 other white middle-class families. In the vein of white fragility and Robin DiAngelo, this book really speaks to what a lot of white people are in denial about, and it is the advantages and the benefits that they reap on a regular because of policies enacted dating back to the founding of this country. And so there are some white journalists, some white authors, some white scholars, sociologists, and I don't know, some everyday white folks who are willing to acknowledge what benefits they have that are different from African Americans. And so Tracie McMillan decided, rather than just talk about it amongst her friends, she would write a book. In fact, she did the math. And she said the advantages that she's gotten over her life from being white, she estimated those advantages to be the equivalent of $371 million worth of benefits just from being a white woman. Very interesting book, very interesting conversation. I'm looking forward to having with Tracie. Congratulations, first of all, Tracie, on the success of this really important book, and the timing. The release could not have been more timely.
Thanks, Areva. I really appreciate your interest.
Tell me, what has the response been? I know the book just came out right in April of this year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, response has been all right. Not a lot of reviews, a lot more news coverage, right? Which is sort of different from the last time I published a book. And I have to say, it's been really interesting to me as a writer who sort of understood that I was writing a book about white experience, to find that the folks that are most open to having this conversation about white advantage often are not white folks, right? Like, I've gotten a lot of support from Black audiences, Black journalists, Black publications, because I think folks in those communities, right, understand how important it is to be honest about this stuff if we're going to move forward as a nation. And it's a harder sell, I think, for white folks often.
So I know, in addition to being an accomplished author, you are also a journalist. So in your role as journalist, have you had an opportunity to interview Robin DiAngelo about her book, White Fragility? And did that book in any way inspire you to write this book?
No, I don't have any interactions with Robin, whose work I certainly know and have read through. And I think there's a lot of value in it. Like, certainly reading through White Fragility as a white person, I was like, oh, that's painful. I think I did that one, like that time and things like that. But I think for me, as important as conversations like White Fragility are, they sort of don't take us all the way that we need to go, right? Because it's so centered on individual behavior and thinking in your head. And so much of the real power of racism is that it's structural, right? Is that there's things built into the economy that make sort of community level wealth very difficult to build, and all those things. And that's not just about one white person like getting too defensive during a conversation, right? I will also, go ahead.
Go ahead, no, finish.
I was going to say, I will also say, as much as I think the structural stuff is important, the more I worked on the white bonus, the clearer it became to me that if we're going to talk about individual white behaviors, the thing that's the most problematic, I think, is often not necessarily doing something where you're stepping in it in terms of racial conversation, but when we don't speak up against racism when we see it, and certainly when white folks are voting in favor of racist policies. Like, those are the things where I feel like individual white behavior really needs to be paid attention to.
So what was the impetus? Where did you get the idea? What motivated you? Were you sitting around watching a movie? Were you having conversations with a friend? This is not necessarily, if you think about books that people would write, white women would write in particular, I wouldn't put this high on the list of things that would come to mind. So what really inspired you to write this book on this topic?
Yeah, really, it's my response to hillbilly elegy. Like I am also a child of the industrial Rust Belt. I also came out of a house where there was, not actually the degree of financial hardship in Vance's life, but certainly I grew up with a lot of abuse in my household, which I write about in the book. And I just felt like, it's important to have an honest conversation about how horrific poverty is for anybody, whatever their race is, when they're experiencing it. Like that is an awful thing. And it's also really important to figure out how to have that conversation while being honest about the ways that racism shapes our society, right? Because I think so often when you start having a conversation about white poverty, all the gravity shifts there. And we forget about the fact that as bad as it is to be poor for anybody, it's easier on balance to be white and poor than it is to be Black and poor, right? And that's a problem. Like, and I think the ultimate solution is to end poverty, not to be like, well, let's just make Black poverty more like white poverty, right? That's not, keeping poverty is not the solution here, right? But I really was like, I want a way to talk about race and class in a way that's real. And the other thing for me, as somebody who came out of a family with a lot of abuse and dysfunction, I just felt like, my individual, when I would be hearing people of color talking about the experience of racism and what that felt like and sort of that emotional experience, the thing that I could latch onto was very much the abuse that I had grown up with, right? And that would sort of create an echo. It's not the same thing, but it's the same sort of tool at a different scale. And so for me, I wanted some space to try and figure that out because unfortunately, I think abuse is a really common thing for a lot of people when they're growing up. And so if you can sort of unlock that parallel, I think for me, my willingness to sort of speak up about racism really amplified once I was like, oh, like all this crappy stuff that happened to me, it was really hard. And that was like one parent not dealing with the stress in their life well and taking it out on me. And what would it be like if it was like 400 years of history and an entire society that was pulling that stuff on you, right? And creating it, like that's just hard.
It's interesting because I have interviewed Robin DiAngelo about her book, White Fragility, and particularly it was around the time after George Floyd's murder that the book became, like uber popular. Everybody was buying it and reading it. And she described kind of a similar background to what you just described, growing up in an abusive household, being very poor, having, she didn't even finish college until she was much older as an adult. People had written her off, called her basically poor white trash. And she overcame a lot of those obstacles. So when I think about her and I'm thinking about you, obviously she's gone on to be a professor, gotten her PhD, very successful. You are obviously very successful. When you talk to your white friends, your white women, if you did before you decided to write this book, what was the response? Or even now that you've written it, are people giving you the side eye? Like, because I remember interviewing a white guy who wrote a book about reparations and how much his family had benefited. And he told me his white friends were livid that he would write and, disclose what, wealth his family had accumulated because of how Black land had been stolen. And he made the case for reparations.
Yeah, I will say in my personal life, not so much. I mean, I think that's, I have a lot of friends of various races, right? I go between Detroit and New York. I've lived in Black communities for most of my adult life. And certainly I'm aware, right, that even though I stumbled into where I'm at as a college kid, right, I was part of gentrification, things like that. But I mean, I would say the thing that's been harder and seems to make people more uncomfortable because I have this very clear discussion of abuse that I grew up with, because those are side by side. People seem to be a little more comfortable with the race conversation if they're talking to me than the abuse conversation, right? Mm-hmm. And because it's a math problem in some ways, it's not that hard to sort of talk about that. And I think that because I do this analysis on my own family and then spread it out to 4 other families, it sort of creates this conversational framework that gives people space to not feel quite so defensive, right? So, I mean, part of the way that I've written the book is that it's very much I statements. It's like, here's what I experienced, what this other person experienced. And then if someone who's reading is open to thinking about, well, what did it mean for my family? They can choose that. Or they can just stay thinking like, okay, this is about Tracie and these 4 other families and that's it. And it's not the same tone for folks. So far that's gone well. I will also say, right, I don't run in particularly conservative circles, right? I'm not part of the conservative media world. And I would imagine I mean, every once in a while I get a sort of nasty email over the transom right about the book, but mostly.
But you did say that you weren't getting the kind of reviews and the kind of response to this book, and that you were getting more, you know, you were being receptive in Black circles more than what I'll call mainstream corporate or legacy media circles. Why do you think that is?
I think
if you're not, pointing the finger, if you're saying this is just my personal story about my family and 4 other families, it's not, an indictment on all white people.
Right. I think it makes people really uncomfortable, right? And I think that most of the folks who are in charge of assigning at major sort of legacy institutions, right, those are really deep benches of folks like I'm at the tail end of Gen X. So those are folks like early Gen X and boomer generation, where this is a much more uncomfortable conversation. Most of the folks that are in those assigning positions, they either are white folks of those generations, or they're people of color who, in order to get purchase in those institutions, have to navigate sort of white judgment, right? And so I think it's a difficult conversation to have. And this is also, I will say, this has become clearer to me as I've gone through this, right? I have these numbers in the book. This is all back of the envelope, sort of rough estimates for stuff, right? Like none of this is me actually going through, I mean, a little bit with my own, right? But a lot of this is relying on estimates, people's recollections. It's all a bare minimum. So it's very easy for somebody to say, well, this is not a perfect social science method, right? And I make that clear in the book that that's what I'm doing. But I think as soon as people feel uncomfortable, they say, well, this is not social science at that level, so we don't even want to talk about it. And my sort of return to that is, I understand that this is imperfect, but if we don't start talking about it somehow, if we wait for the perfect number, we're never going to have the conversation. And I don't think that we can actually move forward as a country with our racial problems until we're honest about the fact that racism is not just something that hurts people of color, it is also helping most white people, right? And there's ways to close that gap where we help everybody forward, right? I don't think this is about punishing people, but we got to be honest about the thing that we're dealing with if we're going to address it.
How did you find the other families that were willing to be a part of this project?
Yeah, traditional journalistic methods, right? So in Pittsburgh, I have an SEIU nurse who I met through a reunion. In Texas, it's a boomer age woman who fell into working poverty and died because she did not have health insurance, right? Which is an outgrowth of racism. I knew her sister, and that family was open to talking about it. In Hattiesburg, Mississippi, I found a pair of millennial sisters through sort of professional colleagues and friends when I was just sort of casting through social media. And then in California, right, I have a guy who grew up working class in Connecticut, like lower middle class, working class in Connecticut, who managed to show up at school, deal drugs on school grounds, threaten somebody, and end up with, larceny and extortion charges in 1994, height of the drug war, and gets given an alternative to incarceration, which I should say, for any 17-year-old kid pulling that crap, that is the right response, right? I don't think you should just throw somebody away at 17 like that, right? But as a white kid, right, got to walk away from that. And that was also somebody that I had actually known in New York and was open to sharing his story.
So, Tracie, the book is called The White Bonus. Let's talk about what the bonus is. And is the bonus different from white privilege? Because everybody's familiar with that concept. I should say everybody, but it's a more familiar phrase to talk about white privilege. It can be very divisive for a lot of people. It's very triggering for a lot of people when you use that phrase. But is white bonus the same as white privilege?
I mean, white bonus is a variation of white privilege, but it's much more concrete and specific, right? So it's something you can measure and grab your hands around. Because I feel like privilege is really slippery, and you sort of say, well, I didn't have much money, so therefore where's my white privilege? Like, what do I really get for being white, right? And I feel like I've heard that question again and again. And really the start of the book was me being like, what do I really get for being white? I've had hard things happen, and I also know enough about this country to know that racism probably is affecting my life. And it's so much more comfortable for me as a white person to think about how it hurts somebody else and be like a sympathetic, supportive person than think about the ways that I'm benefiting from something, and how do you address a system where I'm getting an unfair benefit, right? Or being given something that I have every right to as a citizen, but that we're denying all these other people. Right. And so what's my role there? And so for me, the bonus is like making white privilege concrete and specific and sort of chart out how it actually really shows up in your own life for a white person.
So I know you said some folks look at the book and say, well, you're not a social scientist, and this isn't, a very scientific method that you've calculated what this bonus is or what this advantage is in monetary terms. And I guess some folks would be, rightfully thinking we have so many experiences, right, that shape our success, our failure, our economic status. How did you really go about measuring those that are attributable to you being white versus, you being a woman, for instance, where there's certain advantages and disadvantages, right, in our society, being a male patriarchal society. We know that women often are disadvantaged in the workplace. I know I'm often asked myself, people have asked me, do I experience more racism or more sexism, as if I can separate myself into two different entities. So if you're thinking about advantages that you've gotten from being white, how do you separate, what you might have gotten as an advantage from being a woman? And is there some value in being a white woman that's different from being, a non-white woman? So when we come forward, I want you to give us a little bit more details about how you made that determination, because for a lot of people, if it's not as concrete as, I was selected for a job and they told me I got this job because I'm white, they refuse to see the advantage of their whiteness. And again, when we talk about advantages because of whiteness, a lot of people get really uncomfortable with that. And we're seeing this backlash, right, happening right now in this country around this notion that Black folks should get any benefit from the historical wrongs that have been done to us. So Tracie, that $371 million.
It's thousand.
Oh, I'm sorry. 371,000. Yes, I got the math wrong.
No, not million.
Let me correct that. $371,000. I don't know why I'm seeing more digits here. How did you get to that's still a big number? Almost $500,000. Yes. How did you get to that number, $371,000?
Sure. So about half of that, about 146,000 of that, that's based on what I call a family bonus. So that's the amount of money my family gave to me after I turned 18 or left home. And then what I do is I've gone back through my family's history. I do this with the other subject as well, and sort of say, well, how likely is it my family would have had that money to give me if they hadn't been white, right? And so then I was able to dig into things like the history of housing discrimination and racial covenants, right, which several of my sort of ancestors, right, had on their the deeds of their houses, which then let them build equity and wealth that they then were able to give to my parents, and then my parents were able to buy their home. Employment discrimination, right? I have a banker who was a grandfather, became a banker in the late 1920s at a time when out of 250,000 bankers in the US, 80 were Black, right? So highly unlikely Grandpa would have had that job. So, right. So I can't prove like Grandpa got hired because he was white. But I can say like, look, Grandpa was able to build this money because he was a banker and he had a racist covenant on his house. Really unlikely they would have been able to do that directly, right, if he had been Black, right? So we have that's sort of the first half of it. And the rest of the money there, right, about 225,000, that's more my social bonus. So that's stuff that about points in my life that are important for me generating income or wealth, where I can tell racism probably had a helping hand, right? And so this is stuff like I get hired to work for a wealthy family when I'm in college, right? Because I look like somebody that could be the sister of the girls, because the mom wanted somebody who could show her girls that people like them had to work, right? And so they had people of color coming into the house.
You were hired to show rich kids that working has value.
Right. You got to work. And, it's a nice instinct, right? To be like, I want my kids to know, because I mean, the woman I worked for, she had put herself through college also, right? And so for her, this was her way to try and help her kids. But it was this weird conversation where she was like, look, my kids are never going to have to work, and they need to know somehow that people do. And, so that's part, right? So part of why I was hired there was that I was white, right? Now, I can't prove that if it was me versus Black me, that I would not have been hired, right? That I don't think racism on an interpersonal level actually works in that simplistic of a way. But once you start pulling together all these points in my life, right, I end up with quite, a lot more money than I certainly thought going into it. And I should also say that 371,000, right, that's adjusted for inflation, right? So the dollar amounts like have varied or whatever over time. But the idea is you sort of look at, well, how much did your family give you? Would they have had that money if they weren't white? And then have your job opportunities, have your sort of housing opportunities, all the things that help you build a financial life and build wealth. How likely is it that being white probably was putting the thumb on the scale in your favor? And for me, that's sort of the number I came up with.
So you know who Jane Elliott is, right?
Who?
Jane Elliott.
I do not, which is really embarrassing.
No. No need to be embarrassed at all. She is an educator, and she did a lot of work around folks coming to. She's I guess before DEI got super popular, she did a lot of work around diversity, equity, inclusion. She became known for her blue eyes, brown eyes exercise. She first conducted with a group of kids, third grade kids in 1968. And this was, showing dolls with different, black skin, brown eyes, blue eyes to little girls and asking them, or kids really, which one was pretty, which one did they like. And it led her to, become a motivational speaker and a speaker around the issues of race and helping people really get in kind of a touch with their white privilege, really, the things that you take for granted, like walking into a store and seeing that all of the products have white faces on them, and only seeing like a little small section like this that says, like ethnic products or black products, but everything else in that store is marketed to and, was designed with the fact that white people would be the ones shopping in the store. So she has all these really cool exercises to help people.
Right. I'm familiar with the exercise. I did not remember her name. So
the reason I ask is because I'm curious for you, as you went through this process of evaluating what your advantages were for being white. Did you, how shocking were some of these things to you? Because I don't imagine people wake up every morning and say, because I walk into a store and everything in the store has a white face on it. A lot of people it's so normalized, right? You think that's normal. You think that's the way it should be. But obviously to calculate this $371,000 that you did, you had to do some deep soul searching. So I'm just trying to, have you talk about what you learned through that process.
I mean, the degree to which white folks have been helped actively by government and private policy that government refused to intervene in it was so overwhelming, right? So I had a vague sense. Of course, like racism has happened. We had the civil rights movement, all that. I mean, and I'm somebody, I've thought about race for most of my adult life and sort of been engaged to some degree, but to sort of sit down and be like, okay, well, how would you measure it? What research is out there? It's everywhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's this thing where I'm like, I have, when my Black friends have been like, oh, like there's a lot of it and it's everywhere. And I'm like, okay, like, yeah. And then I go and I document, right? I'm like, oh, wait, like when my dad told me that we moved when I was 4 years old because we needed to get into a good school district. If we'd stayed where we were, he would have had to pay for private schools. He wasn't actually looking at school quality. He was looking at the fact that this district we had been living in was integrating, right? 13 years after the school district had been sued in 1968 for operating a segregated district in the North, right? Things like that. And also, I will say, I think the thing that really lit a bit of a fire in me is just how much of even recent history has been hidden from us, right? We talk so much about expanding the sort of understanding of the history of enslavement, and all that is incredibly important. And also, we don't even talk honestly about the history of like the mid to late 20th century, right? And schools and how race worked in that. I mean, I was raised to think that white flight was about cities being full of rioters, right? And it was about schools. It was about white people not wanting to share schools with Black people, right? And so I think for me, getting to do this work meant I could dig in and really look at this architecture of white supremacy that's been built into our economy and our, honestly, often our political structures. And people have been working at making improvements, right, to sort of make this country actually live up to its ideals. But I generally understood it before, but to sort of sit down and be like, oh, it isn't everything, It's in pretty much everything. When people
No, it isn't really. It's in everything. And that's one of the things that Jane Elliott, she's 87 years old, made her so angry, is that when people would say, I don't see color, I don't see black or white. And what she tries to help people understand is you can say that because you have the freedom of ignoring, the fact that black people are at such a disadvantage in this country because of policies. And simple things like that. When I started having these conversations with Jane Elliott, I would tell people, just walk into a store, pick up a magazine, and see how everything in this country is built with the thoughts that white people. I had this conversation with some medical school students. It took years and years before there were images in medical school books of anyone other than white men. Doctors were trained on how to treat conditions, assuming that every patient they would see would be a white man, even to the point where some doctors told me they couldn't even detect skin diseases and cancer on color, people of color, because that wasn't in the book. They weren't taught that. And so to have people say, well, that doesn't mean, that this country is racist. That doesn't mean anything, because all the magazines and all the books and all the advertising and all the everything is built around white people. This can be exhausting. When we come forward, we take a little break, but I do want to ask you about how exhausting this work is. It's exhausting for me trying to explain it to people. So I can imagine that as you do this work, you've talked to these 4 other families, you've talked to others, you've done these interviews, and just thinking about it can be really exhausting, particularly in this moment where there's so many attacks on DEI and so much disinformation out there to suggest that somehow white people are being discriminated against now in the workplace, and that we need to roll back all of the gains that we made during the civil rights era. Tracie, as I was saying, there are a lot of white folks today saying that they are being discriminated against by workplace diversity programs, affirmative action, and other policies that are meant to address the legacy of racism. When you hear those attacks being made, when you see the lawsuits being filed, like the one against the Fearless Fund, like the lawsuit that challenged affirmative action in college admissions, like all of these lawsuits that have been filed attacking pretty much any policy in government or private industry that attempts to address the legacy of slavery and racism in this country, what does that make you think? I mean, how do you feel when you see that, given the exercise that you and these other 4 families have just undergone?
I mean, for me, I think like the generous way to look at that is that those folks must not understand history very well, right? And then, when I'm talking casually with people who are not, sort of out there waging sort of conservative fights, I say, look, we had affirmative action for white people for a really long time. That's how my grandparents did all right. That's how most of the grandparents, the folks that I talked to, how they were able to build some wealth. And it's only fair that if we had a thumb on the scale in favor of white folks for a really long time, that if we believe in living up to the founding fathers' values, right? If we believe that we're all equal, we haven't treated everybody equal. We got to spend some time repairing that inequity, right? If we really believe that. And if you don't believe that, then just be honest about it. I mean, I'm somebody who's sort of like, look, let's just be honest about this, cards on the table, and move forward from there. And I think for me, the thing that really bothers me, particularly about these really disingenuous lawsuits about I'm not getting treated fairly, is it's just like, just say it. Just say that you don't really think that we should all be equal. Just say that outright, right? Because I really think that that's at the core of this, right? It's this people who are like, I don't really think that I think that I'm good. I should be better and I should be given special treatment. The fact is, like, if we're all equal, sometimes someone's going to get a little more help than the other person, and that's all fine. But like, what we want is to sort of have things be roughly equal as we move forward.
Well, we even see a big human resources organization like SHRM say they're taking the word equity out of their DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy, because the president, Johnny Taylor, says the word equity is divisive. People don't understand it. I think that's nonsense. I think equity is very easy for people to understand. But as you said, people won't be honest about the fact that they like the hierarchical structure that exists in this country today. They like the notion that white people, no matter if you're poor or uneducated, that you are superior and that you are given special privileges simply because of your whiteness and then your proximity some minority groups' proximity to whiteness affords them certain benefits. But yet we see folks like Donald Trump, those MAGA supporters of Donald Trump, hammer home this point that it's racist when something happens to them. Donald Trump being prosecuted by Letitia James, he calls her a racist. He calls Fani Willis, the African-American prosecutor in Georgia, a racist. It's this victim mentality that not that Donald Trump created, obviously there before he even came onto the scene, but he definitely gives fuel, he gives energy to this concept that white people somehow are now the victims of discrimination simply in situations because, they don't get everything that they want, and they do personalize. Of course, Donald Trump personalizes it. But how might your book in this moment, in this contentious, divisive, political world that we live in, how might folks who are white, who are a part of the MAGA group, who see you, hear you talk, read your book, how might they understand race and racism differently and understand that Letitia James is not being racist against Donald Trump when he's being, indicted or charged with whatever crimes, or, he has to face the criminal justice system in the way that we know has disproportionately impacted people of color.
Right. Well, I think, honestly, folks that are really deep into MAGA probably are not going to be very interested in this book, right? Like that is a movement that's got a very specific hardline ideology that is not about addressing the world as it is. And, good luck to them if they find anything that's of use. That's great. I do think my book can be helpful for anybody who actually wants this country to be what we're told it is in grade school, right? Which is equal, giving everybody like a decent shot at a decent life, right? Using the wealth of this country to make sure like everybody's kind of okay. And then if you work really hard, you can excel and you can go have like a crazy extra nice house or whatever, but like to not have homelessness and things like that, right? Like there's ways that we can build together. And I think it's really dangerous when we say, well, we're tired of talking about race, so that means we're just never going to talk about it. We're never going to be honest, right? I understand that it is tiresome, and including for people who are not white, right, to have to keep talking about this thing over and over and over again. And I think the reason we keep talking about it is because we're never honest about it, right? So if we're actually interested in moving forward, we just got to be honest. And
let me ask you this, Tracie. You just said something very interesting. If we're actually interested in moving forward. So if white people benefit, you $371,000, there may be others where my number of 371 million is the accurate number. But if white people are benefiting from anti-Black racism, as you have documented in your book, why would there ever be any incentive, or will they ever have an incentive to change the system?
Well, I got the 371,000 right, but I would not have needed almost any of that if we had quality public higher education that was free, and if we had affordable housing, right? Most of that money is stuff that got funneled into education and housing for me, right? So if we actually bond together as people, we can build a community and a society where most of us are taken care of and don't need necessarily this sort of private safety net out of families, right? I mean, for me, once you start taking out how much money I have to spend on health insurance, right, because I'm self-employed, how much money and debt I had to take on to go to university, right? How much like housing costs, all of that, right? If my life would be better and way less stressful if those things were taken care of. And if all I got to do to get to that is stop being quite so racist so I can sort of bond together with people, right, who don't look like me, but also would like to have, like affordable housing and schools their kids can afford to go to that are of good quality. Like for me, that's an important argument to make. And part of the book, I should say, does talk about the cost of racism, right? Because racism is what blows up our capacity to build a social safety net and real solutions, right, to these social problems. And for me, that's really important to point out, right? Because I think it's important to talk about this bonus because we never talk about it. But individually, for me, part of the reason it's interesting is once I'm honest about what I get, then I can be honest about how much it costs, right? Because I don't have a leg to stand on as a white person walking around being like, look at how bad racism is for everybody. Because it's true, it's bad for most of us, right? Including most white people. But I got to be honest to start about like, look, this is valuable. And I also think it would be better for me if we had this stuff provided more generally.
Well, thank you for being so honest about that. You know, there's a big part of your book and a big part of this conversation that has to do with who deserves, right, to benefit from what in this country. I had a Black professor's Black history chair and professor at St. Louis University put it this way. He says, look, when slaves were brought to this country, they were treated like an object, like a chair, like a table. Then we went through the Emancipation Proclamation. We went through, you know, Reconstruction, Jim Crowism, Civil Rights Movement. But for a lot of people, what they passed down, a lot of white people, they passed down the notion that Black people are like a chair, and humans are always superior to objects and definitely superior to a chair. And he says what we are facing today is trying to get people to recognize that this, you know, Black people are not chairs. We're not tables. And he says, you know, just changing policies, changing words and documents, changing laws, you know, having Supreme Court decisions is hard for a lot of people when we started out in their minds as a chair. And that gets us into that bigger conversation about who deserves what. Because if you believe that Black people fundamentally are not deserving of the same benefits, the same privileges as white people, simply because they were a chair when they came to this country, it's very hard for them to recognize what you said are the benefits of being anti-racist. Thank you so much, Tracie, for sitting down with me. Again, her book is The White Bonus, 5 Families and the Cash Value of Racism in America, an important book for anyone and everyone to read, particularly in this moment. Best of luck to you as you continue to promote this book and talk about the values and benefits of being anti-racist.